Okay, in this segment, we're going to talk about the different research methods that are used in social psychology. Now, honestly, there are different statistical techniques and different strategies that are used in social psychology, but they are pretty complex. And so what I'm going to try and do is just give you sort of an overview of how some of the things that you may have learned about in scientific principles or in your stats class apply in social psychology, and not take you off into, PhD level cluster analysis and path analysis. I'm just going to kind of talk about like general principles. So let's start off with a revisiting of what is a theory and what is a hypothesis. So a theory is an explanation that organizes the existing evidence. A lot of times people don't really know what a theory is. And so it's really super important to know that theories are never proven, right? These are assertions that are made by someone who is familiar with the data, is familiar with, whatever the subject matter is. And they say, you know what, I'm seeing a pattern in this data and in this subject, and I have an idea for how we might account for that pattern. So as soon as the person has generated a theory, let's say Freud has asserted that the timing of potty training leads to these different personality types. So he makes a theory. The next thing that's going to happen is that other researchers are going to start generating hypotheses that are testable predictions. So we're going to have, a prediction. Okay, so we ask a mom, let's say, how old was your child when they were fully potty trained? And so we write down the number of how old they were. And then when the child is 25, let's say, we come back and we see whether there are, in fact, personality differences between those whose moms said were potty trained earlier and those whose moms said were potty trained later, right? Like that's a testable prediction. I make a prediction, I collect the data, and see whether the hypothesis test actually supports the theory. So do we find that, in fact, the people who are potty trained younger have different traits than the ones who are potty trained later? So a hypothesis usually comes out of a theory. And usually the point of a hypothesis is to give us the opportunity to determine whether that theory is wrong or not. It sounds like a backwards thing to do, but we want to find out, is this theory wrong? There's not a lot of point in trying to find evidence that it's right, because the person who generated it already thinks it's right. What we want to find is evidence that it's wrong. And so, for the past 125 years or something, maybe we're coming up on 150 years of evolutionary theory, scientists' goals have been to find evidence against evolution. I just read an article this week on the internet, always a good source of information, but it was on somebody's sort of blog, and they said, that this theory has yet to be disproven. That doesn't sound very scientific. Well, that is the scientific method, is to generate hypothesis tests that have the ability to show us if the theory is actually wrong. Like that's our goal, is to try and show that the theory is wrong. If the hypothesis test doesn't show that the theory is wrong, that helps to strengthen the theory. Okay, well, it stood up to that hypothesis test. That doesn't mean that theory is right. It just means that it's not wrong yet. So we keep testing like that. We keep trying to find evidence that it's wrong. The more evidence that piles up that is actually supporting the theory, compared to the amount of evidence that's piling up that is refuting the theory, the more we start to accept that the theory might be on the right track. I'm really careful in describing that because we never use the word proven. There are certain things in physics that are laws, and that's different because these are very concrete things that, ultimately you can establish the law, the law of momentum or the law of inertia, and these kinds of things can be ultimately established. But a lot of other scientific theories, it's possible that with the right piece of data, we would finally find out that actually this theory doesn't explain everything. So theories usually are the impetus for the development of a hypothesis, and then a hypothesis helps to inform the theory, right, to help shape it. Now, in psychology in general, social psychology of course, being a subset, we follow a principle called systematic empiricism. What that means is that we make a prediction ahead of time. Usually that prediction is going to either be based on a theory, or in some areas of psychology, we don't have a really coherent theory. We just have, some studies that we're just trying to figure out whether these are a good pattern, and somebody needs to come along and organize it into a theory still. Like, we haven't gotten to that point yet in that area. So it's either based on a theory or maybe based on the previous research that's been done. We make a prediction. Then we collect data. And the thing that makes systematic empiricism is that the data must be measured in a way that that data could be confirmed by other people. So it needs to be, I mentioned earlier that the behaviorists don't like to talk about the mind because they can't directly see the mind. So they're being just complete empiricists. They're saying we can only study the things that we can directly see. Now, in psychology, we've had to get a little bit creative in what we mean by things we can directly see, because otherwise we're kind of stuck only studying drooling and shivering and other kinds of behavioristic subject matter. And that's not that fun. It's not that interesting. So, and we kind of, 50 years of studying those things, we seem to feel like we kind of know the patterns. So we want to study other kinds of things like attitudes, right? Well, we've gotten clever in coming up with ways of objectively measuring attitudes in a way that could be confirmed by other people, right? Like we use surveys or scales, things like that. So it's not necessarily a behavior that has to be done out in public that everybody could witness. It could be stuff that has gone on in your head or that's gone on in your past, and we rely on you reporting it. And then finally, the last step is going to be data analysis, where we use some kind of statistical analysis to either support or reject the prediction that we made at the beginning. And so the data analysis is really a test of the prediction. So statistics give us quantifiable ways of indicating whether our prediction was supported or refuted. So statistics are really super helpful for us. Don't worry, I'm not leading into a discussion of statistics, so don't worry, I'm not going to make you calculate anything. I just want to say that's why we do them, is because they give us this objective way of assessing whether the prediction was supported or refuted. Now, our data sources, like I said, we've gotten pretty creative over the past, 120 years of psychology, where we've learned how to develop surveys, for example. Surveys are really the bread and butter of all of psychology, and especially social psychology. I mean, social psychology wouldn't exist if we weren't able to do self-report surveys or certain kinds of scales that can get, a reliable answer out of respondents. Now, our textbook goes into a lot of the shortcomings of surveys, and I'm not going to bog down with that right now. You can read it in the textbook, and I'm kind of counting on your intro to psych teacher to have taught you some of these things, or maybe you've heard them in other ways. But I just want to, tick off a couple of issues that we're all aware of. So in case you're listening to this and you're thinking to yourself, well, that's not a very good objective data source. In psychology, we take a lot of care in developing our surveys and scales. We don't generate a bunch of questions and then just ask participants. We have standardized scales. We have scales that have been tested and validated across a number of different types of people or samples, so that when we use these kinds of tools, we're not usually going to have tools that are as subject to the problems with surveys as you would see in, let's say, a poll. So we correct for example, social desirability. We want to make sure that our questions aren't leading in such a way that the respondent thinks that they have to say this answer or else they'll be thought badly of, right? You have to phrase the questions in such a way that they can give their true answer without feeling like they want to present themselves in a certain way, which is what social desirability is. We have to be really careful about the wording of our questions. We have to counterbalance them so that if some participants see this option first, others need to see that option first, right? Like we have to counterbalance the response options. we make sure to correct for these kinds of things. And if you don't, as a social psychologist, when you go to publish, the peers will say, did you counterbalance that? How do you know that your respondents weren't just displaying social desirability? How do you know that they weren't just responding to the way that you worded the question? They'll ask you that, and then, you won't be able to get that out into the literature unless you did actually take care of those issues. So the first thing psychologists did was study the shortcomings of survey questions, and then they internalized that and started developing surveys and scales that were a lot more resistant to the framing issues and other kinds of things that our textbook tells us are problems with the surveys. I'm not trying to argue surveys are perfect. One of my big struggles during the pandemic is I had to transition my research out of the lab and onto the internet in order to keep my students busy and to keep my publication plans in order. And so one of my biggest struggles is whether one participant in my class or in my sample who wants to get extra credit in their class might go through the survey more than one time, maybe using a different device so that the IP address protection that I put in there so that the same IP address can't sign in. They might go through it more than once, and this time they're male, that time they're female, this time they're 25, that time they're 50. They're just putting things in, and it has nothing to do with any reality. Like, that's my biggest fear with online surveys, is that we do not know who's answering those questions. We do not know whether somebody has gone through multiple times or if they're just completely lying to us. One of the things that I do in my online surveys now is I make sure I put a question in the middle of any survey that says, if you're really reading this, select number 6, you know what I mean? So that if they're not really answering the questions, that might help me to figure it out. But I mean, so don't think I'm saying surveys are terrific and they're bulletproof. They aren't. But they're not as bad as some of the weaknesses that this textbook implies, because we know that they exist and we've corrected for a lot of them. All right, enough defensiveness there. Can't get my computer to advance. That's weird. There we go. Behavioral observation. Now, this picture that I've selected to illustrate it, this is being done in the lab. So you've got some people in an adjacent room behind a two-way mirror having some kind of conversation or engaging in some kind of activity. And then you've got the researcher in the other room watching on a screen and recording behaviors. That's one way that you can do it, right? Where you can actually, they know that they're being watched, and they have been assigned to talk about whatever they're talking about. Behavioral observation can happen in much more natural situations also, like at work or out on the quad at school, or in a classroom, or we have naturalistic observations that happen out in malls, or just all sorts of places where humans gather. They're really popular in studies of children, because children oftentimes can forget that they're being watched. It's a little trickier with adults, because if they perceive that they're being watched, they may change their behavior. And so it can be kind of tricky to do behavioral observation if the observed recognizes that they are being watched. So one of the things that researchers will try to do is be, hidden, for lack of a better word. And then that gets us into sort of some ethical issues. If the person doesn't know that they're being watched, but yet they are being watched, and they are, at the minimum, notes are being taken about their behavior, have you violated their rights? And so social psychologists discuss this all the time. Social psychologists are the ones who are most likely to go out into a natural situation to try and see how people actually behave. And so it's something that they talk about a lot. In other fields, we are much more likely to use laboratory research or the kind of behavioral observation that you see in this picture. It's when you're out in the natural world where the person, maybe they are in public, so they don't have any reason to believe that they should have privacy, but they don't know that the things that they're doing are being recorded for the purposes of a study. Like, a great example was a study that was conducted where the researchers went to the airport and they recorded, the ways people said goodbye to each other. I mean, you don't expect privacy at the airport, but you also kind of think no one would really care what I'm doing because they're all doing their own things. You don't realize that there might be a researcher over there, recording whether you hugged the person who drove you to the airport goodbye or not, right? It's kind of a gray area about this naturalistic observation out in the real world. And we'll talk about ethics a little bit later. Another data source would be what we call archival data. And here's a nice, that looks like probably somebody's medical records, but archival data is where instead of observing or asking the person about their behavior, you go into some kind of record source to determine whether they've engaged in that behavior. So for example, it could be arrest records. It could be, school records. It could be military records. It could be a lot of different kinds of, some of them are, public records, like have they ever bought a house before or owned a business? Those are public records. It could be private records like medical records or grades or something like that. A lot of times when you do archival research, the organization that holds the records, like let's say the school, they are willing to release unidentifiable data. And so, for example, let's say that I was doing a study where I wanted to compare the GPAs of transfer students who came into the university with a direct transfer degree from a community college during their, let's say, junior year to those who had started at the university in their freshman year. So let's say I wanted to find out whether GPAs differ between those two groups. I could use archival research and ask the university to blind, don't tell me anybody's names, but give me all the grades for, the first quarter juniors. And all I need to know is, did they come in with a DTA or did they start here as a freshman? Like, that's all I need to know. And so when we do archival research, there are very, easy ways to make sure that you're not revealing any individual's personal stuff as part of the research. Like, the researcher doesn't need to know who it was necessarily, just that it was. In other research, they do want to tie it to an individual. So let's say I'm doing a study where I want to see whether people whose parents were divorced are more likely to get divorced themselves. So I'd really have to know who everybody is so I can follow, whose parents were married and who's got divorced, and then follow those individuals into their own adulthood and their own marriages. And so I'd have to know their names. So while that's an archival data study, that one you'd have to know the individual so you could track them across time, right? And so that's another one of these ethical situations. Do I need to ask that individual whether I can see their marital records, or do I just go into the public records and draw that? These are big issues that social psychologists face with regard to how to collect the data, right? Like, is it ethical to get data just because you can? So, but these are our main ways of getting data in social psychology. Now, the main research methods would be correlational, where we're looking to see whether there is a relationship between two variables. I pulled this off of Our World in Data's website, and this is showing a correlation between self-reported life satisfaction and gross domestic product per capita. This is from 2017. And so you can see different countries listed there. And what I wanted you to see basically is that what it basically is a scatter plot showing us for each individual country what their GDP per capita is, and then their life satisfaction rating on the y-axis. But what you see is that the line is going up and to the right. This is a nice positive correlation where you're seeing as the GDP for the country goes up, the happiness or the life satisfaction of the citizens goes up. That's what correlations can do for us, is tell us whether two variables go together or not. The important thing is to remember that it doesn't establish causation. So you can't look at this graph that I'm showing you here and say, well, I mean, obviously a higher GDP will make citizens more satisfied. Like, that's not how it works. Correlations can't tell us that. And there are a couple of reasons why not. One is what we call the directionality problem. It's possible, and I switched it to income, not GDP, but it's good enough. So it's possible that income leads to happiness, right? It's possible that, having more income makes you happier and having less income makes you less happy. It's possible that that's the way the cause flows, but it's also possible that happiness leads to higher income. and that unhappiness leads to lower income, right? It's possible that having an overall predisposition of being happy maybe makes people want to hire you, or makes people want to pay you more or something, right? I mean, we don't know which way this direction flows if there's a correlation between these two things. There's another issue, though, called the third variable problem, which is where it may be not that income leads to happiness or happiness leads to income. It could be that other factors, some third variable, like I just listed a couple, cultural factors that could lead to income and then also could lead to happiness, personality factors that could lead to happiness and could lead to income. The key thing is, whatever you might think of as a third variable, that it's the important factor in determining both the income and the happiness that we're observing. And so it's really super important whenever you see a correlation to not do what is our natural tendency to do, which is to go, wow, I wonder why GDP causes satisfaction. Like, you can't say that. All you can say is, wow, that's interesting that those go together. That's all you can say. So we need some other method of research to allow us to be able to establish causation. And that's where experimental research comes in. Experimental research can be done in the lab, or it can be done out in the field. Done in the laboratory, you're going to have a lot more control over everything. And so your causal interpretation will be a lot stronger. But people might behave strangely in the lab, not typically. And so the field might be a better place to get real behavior. So it's like a real trade-off when doing experiments. The key thing about experimental research is it does allow us to establish a cause and effect conclusion. So if in a laboratory, a person behaves differently when they've been given this set of instructions than they do when given that set of instructions, we can say pretty clearly that the instructions are what caused the difference in behavior. In order for us to have this kind of confidence, though, we need to be able to use random assignment. So a true experiment relies on random assignment of the participants. So, of all the participants who are present, half of them randomly get assigned to be in the experimental condition, and half of them get randomly assigned to the control condition. And in this particular study, the experimental participants watch violent TV shows, and the controls watch a non-violent TV show. And then at the end, they both get measured using some measure of aggression. Just FYI, it's not usually, did they go outside and punch someone? It's usually something like, did they dole out more or less Tabasco sauce to an opponent in a fake game as a punishment or something? Or did they crank up the white noise really loud on their opponent's ears when they had the chance? Stuff like that. The good news is nobody really drinks the Tabasco sauce and nobody really gets the white noise blast because there really is no opponent in these setups, because social psychology, right? In social psychology, there's always this trick in the design where you think this person is just a peer, but it turns out, nope, they're a Confederate. They're part of the study. Or you think there's an opponent and nope, you're playing against a computer. So that's kind of I'm kind of laughing while I say this, because this is the fun part of social psychology, is there's always this part where it's not what you think is going on. And that's what kind of makes social psychology really fun. So with the experimental method, though, we get an opportunity to draw these cause and effect conclusions that we all really would like to make. But it's only really, you can only strongly, confidently say that I know that watching violent TV causes aggression if you literally have this random assignment and you control everything and it's happening in the lab. If you take it out into the field, you're going to lose a little bit of that control and a little bit of the confidence in your causal conclusion, right? So the farther you get away from having control, the farther you get away from being able to establish causation. Now, I mentioned random assignment. I wanted to talk a second about something that's really super important in social psychology, which is making sure that the members of the sample represent the population. So here's a fake population. I pulled it off of a website that was teaching this concept. And I'm like, hey, this is actually really clever, because what you see is, males and females of the same race on each line, and they kind of equally distributed them, right? It's 5 and 5, and then there's 5 rows, and so you've got really 10 kinds of people, I guess you could say, based on sex and race. What we do in research is we want to draw from the population a sample that represents that population. So here we have a sample that we drew out, and we ended up with only people from the top row, really, right? This would not be a representative sample. Like there are 4 other rows that really were not drawn from. In sample B, okay, we got a little bit better, a little bit more of a mix, but it's still not really accurately representing that larger population, right? Like now in this one, there is no one from the top row. So in sample C, now we have people in the sample in the same proportions as they would be represented in the population. And so now we can say sample C is doing a good job of representing the larger population. Now in social psychological research, we oftentimes don't get the opportunity to do true representative sampling, where we get make sure that our sample is representing, let's say, the American population. Like usually we don't have those kinds of resources and that kind of opportunity. So what we rely on is that lots of different researchers all around the country are exploring similar topics, and that across all the different studies that are being conducted on this subject, we will ultimately get a representative sample, right? Like if you were to take all of those studies, put them together, then we would see, okay, we're getting close to representing the larger population. In the meantime, for each individual study, you don't try and claim that you're representing the entire American population. You say, this is a sample that was drawn from a mid-sized university in the Pacific Northwest, and let the reader conclude that this doesn't necessarily represent other schools or other populations. It's only representing that population. So we're always really careful to try and manage people's expectations. But the ultimate goal is this representative sampling. We really want it to be the case that when we're making assertions about human behavior, that we really are having samples that represent, the average human. All right, that's a good time to break. We will come back and finish up this chapter with some ethical considerations.